Good morning. This morning's scriptures will be coming from the book of Mark, chapter 14, verses 53 through 72. That's the book of Mark, chapter 14, verses 53 through 72. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. And Peter followed him afar off, even into the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. And the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. For many bare false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there arose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answer thou nothing. What is it which these witness against thee? But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the cloud of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and said, What need we any further witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, Prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palm of their hands. And as Peter was beneath in the palace, there came one of the maids of the high priest. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, And thou also was with Jesus of Nazareth? But he denied, saying, I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest. And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And a maid saw him again, and began to say to them that stood by, This is one of them. And he denied it again. And thereafter, they that stood by said again to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. But he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not this man whom you speak. And the second time the cock crew. And Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said unto him, Before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And when he thought thereon, he wept.
Thank you, Ron, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be here on this fine Lord's Day. I notice we have quite a few visitors with us this morning, and we are grateful that you're here with us at the Northside congregation. We are glad that you decided to be here with us to worship our Father this morning, and you are our honored guests. We hope that you'll make yourself at home, and that you will get to know some of our members here, and that you will find our worship today Christ-centered, God-exalting, and also biblically informed. We've been going through this month talking about the life of Christ. Tell me the story of Jesus right out of the heart, every word. It's the greatest story ever told, and it ought to be in the center of our hearts, and we ought to know it very well. And in the first couple of weeks, we talked about the prophecies surrounding the birth of Christ. We talked about the birth itself. Last week, we picked out some elements to discuss Jesus' ministry, which lasted 3 years. And of course, in a short lesson, you're not going to be able to cover the entirety of Jesus' ministry. But we pointed out some elements of his ministry last week. And now, on these last 3 lessons, we're actually going to be centering in on one particular few days of time. We're going to be covering the final hours of Jesus' life. It's probably a story you know very well. If you've been brought up in the church, if you're a Christian, you realize the story of Jesus. You know this account, and you're probably very familiar with it. That might be the case. There might be some here that have never heard this story before. I know there are some young people here that maybe have never heard the story of Jesus, maybe never heard of the trial, the crucifixion, the resurrection. And so it's for all of us. If we're somebody in the category where we think the story is so familiar, we ought to be careful, because we don't need to make this story too common. There's a danger in that. We stop appreciating it for what it is, and what it means to us when we do that. And so we all, regardless of how familiar or unfamiliar we are with the story, we need to hear it, absorb it, and be touched by the story of Jesus. Today we're going to be talking about his litigation, is what I've named this sermon, just to kind of make it sound like the rest, but we're talking about the trial. We're talking about the trial of Jesus. And the story really begins at the beginning of Matthew 26. All of the gospel accounts record this event in some form, but we're going to focus on Matthew's account this morning and kind of use that as our majority account. And so if you would open your New Testament to Matthew chapter 26, we're just going to go through and notice a couple things. What we're going to do today is I'm going to basically give a snapshot of the events leading up to the trial itself, and to get us to the point of the crucifixion. And so that's where we're going to be going this morning. We're talking about the events immediately leading up to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus being betrayed, and it's going to take us all the way until the crucifixion. And so that's the period of time we're talking about this morning. And so we just want to kind of give a snapshot of that, and then we're going to notice three main points from this story. And I hope that you have your sermon guide. You can see those 3 points on there. You can take notes as we go along. And so first of all, there were several events leading up to the trial that are important to know about. If you notice in 26 and verse 3, it tells us that, 3 and 4, it says, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest at this time over the Sanhedrin court. And they plotted to take Jesus by trickery or deceit and to kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. And so the chief priests, elders, and scribes are all here together plotting to get Jesus, to kill him. It had been their motive for a long time, and this motive had been building, and this anger building amongst them, where they were now finally bringing to pass something that had been in their hearts for much of Jesus' ministry. So they're plotting to find a way in which to sentence Jesus to death. And so this is occurring before the Passover feast. All the Jews from all over the known world that came to that feast were all in town, and Jesus was partaking of the Passover meal with his disciples. He assembled them in the upper room, and he partook of the Passover feast with them. But before that, we're told that Judas Iscariot decided he was going to betray Jesus. He went to these chief priests and elders, and he gave them the chance that they're looking for. He said, I'm going to give you a chance to betray Jesus. And for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a cheap slave, he sold his Lord, waiting for the opportunity. So on the heels of that, now we have the Passover feast. The Passover feast, of course, for the Jews, represented their remembering their deliverance from Egypt, bondage of Egypt. And Jesus does something very interesting. Before, they actually, part of the meal is they would dip the unleavened bread into this sop, into this kind of fruit sauce. And he says that the one of you that dips his hand in the tray with me is going to be the one that betrays me. And Judas asked, is it I? And the Lord said yes. So it was known that Judas was the one that betrayed Jesus. It wasn't something that Jesus was oblivious to. But then, in the course of the Passover, of course, we just partook of the Lord's Supper, which is what Jesus instituted all the way back then. He transformed the Passover, which represented deliverance from physical bondage, to what he represented, bondage from sin, spiritual deliverance. And so he transformed the Jewish Passover into what we call the Lord's Supper, the communion. And so he does that, and after that, he now takes his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, the same group that he took with him to the Mount of Transfiguration. And he goes to a familiar praying spot, the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's late into the night at this point. It's probably 11 or 12 o'clock. We don't really know for sure, but it's well into the night, very dark. And Jesus goes there to pray. And he asks his disciples to watch for him. Keep watch and pray with me. Because he was suffering. He had a lot of grief. And he passionately cried out to his Father. He begged the Father. We'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment. But he begged his Father to let this cup pass from him. He knew the intensity of suffering he was about to undergo. He knew exactly what was coming in the next 24 hours. And the human element of Jesus was begging his Father to let this cup pass from him. But he said, nonetheless, not my will be done, but thy will be done. He knew what he would have to do, but the human element came out, and he was making his petitions known to God. He passionately cried out to the Father with anguish of spirit, and we're told in, I forget if it's the Luke or the John account, that he was sweating as it were blood. Now, some have said that, well, it was just sweat droplets that were so big and so dense that they looked like blood in the size of them, but that really doesn't seem to be the sense here. There's a medical condition that's well known in the medical community that somebody who's undergoing extreme anguish and grief, it's possible for the blood vessels along their skin to burst and for it to look like they're actually sweating blood. And I believe that's what's taking place here with Jesus in the garden. He checks back 3 times with his disciples. They keep falling asleep on him. The first time he checks, you couldn't wait with me just a little while. Well, they didn't fall asleep because they were lazy. Keep in mind that they had been prepared this whole week. Jesus had a very busy week, and the 12 were his protégés. They were with him the whole time. He was teaching in Jerusalem. One of the things that Jesus taught is that he would have to die. He was preparing them for what would have to come after he leaves them. And they were grieved themselves, and they were very tired and worn during the week. They had lack of sleep and so forth, and so we need to give them a little more credit than we do sometimes, but they kept falling asleep. And finally, on the 3rd time, he knew that his captors were coming. He knew that Judas was coming with the Jewish guard, and he knew he was about to be taken into captivity. And so Judas now arriving with the Jewish guard, Judas is doing what he said he was going to do, doing what he got paid to do for those 30 shekels of silver, and his job is to identify Jesus. He says, here's how you're going to know which one Jesus is. I'm going to go give him a kiss and call him rabbi, and you know that's the one you need to get. In the Jewish world, back in that culture, I know it seems a little odd for 2 men to greet each other with a kiss, but back then that was a symbol of great closeness and kind of that family affection. They would kiss each other on the cheek. In many places of the world, they still do that. It's kind of uncommon to our culture, but that was also a sign that you were in with somebody. They didn't just do that to anybody. And so Judas, in doing that, was committing the height of hypocrisy. He says, hi, Rabbi, kisses him on the cheek. And what he's doing in that is he's betraying his Lord to go be put on trial, so to speak, and be crucified. And so this takes place. Peter with his sword. We know Peter, how impetuous he is. He cuts off Malchus' ear, one of the guards. Jesus rebukes him. He says, put away your sword. He attaches Malchus' ear miraculously, and he tells him, I have to go do this. Jesus then goes on to kind of a 2-part Jewish trial. We're not told in the Matthew account, but in the Luke account, we're told that, or the John account rather, we're told that he goes to Annas. Annas was the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas. And he went to Annas' house to be examined by him to see if there's some way that they could get him, and he questioned him and observed him, and there's a little bit recorded in that John. But the majority of Jesus' Jewish trial existed in the court of Caiaphas. And I had another handout printed. There's on one side of it is the trial of the Jewish trial. On the second side is the Roman trial. Jesus did in fact have 2 separate trials, so to speak, if we want to call them that. But the first trial we're talking about is the trial of Caiaphas. And in this trial, the Jews knew they had nothing on him. They knew they had nothing of which they could put him to death. And so you know what they did? They started fishing for stories. Okay, people start making accusations. Let's see if we can get 2 people to agree. In the Jewish system, if you had 2 or 3 witnesses that agreed on something, that's the only way it was admissible. And we're told if you read through all of the accounts, they couldn't get anything tangible. They couldn't accuse him of anything. And finally, there were 2 people that sort of agreed on a misquote on something that Jesus said, and that's what they nabbed him on, when it was talking about the fact that Jesus said that he was going to destroy the temple in 3 days, raise it up. Of course, he wasn't talking about physically destroying the temple. He was talking about the temple of his body. And so that was the charge that they got him on. And in the course of this, Caiaphas gets right to the point. He gets right to the point and he asks Jesus, are you the Christ, the Son of God? That's what Jesus has been preaching. The kingdom's here. I'm the Son of God, the Son of Man. I'm the Christ, the Messiah. And to the Jews, that was blasphemous because they didn't think that he was the Messiah. That was blasphemous to say God was your Father. And so Caiaphas asked him the question, and Jesus told him exactly what he was looking for. He answered it truthfully. He told him, I am the Christ. And he went even further and quoted from the book of Daniel, which we'll look at in more detail when we get to that point. But after hearing Jesus responding in the affirmative, Caiaphas tears his garments. That was a sign in this biblical time of great mourning and astonishment and shock. He said, well, here he is. He's saying he's the Son of God. He's committing blasphemy. Do we need anything else from this guy? And of course, the crowd joins in, and he gets captured, and they beat him, they blindfold him, they're punching him in the face, slapping him, jeering him, saying, okay, if you're such a prophet, why don't you tell me who just hit you? You can't see me. Say who just hit you. Mocking him, ridiculing him. That's the Jewish tribe. Now, by the time it was morning, the council brought Jesus to Pilate. The Jews had a limited form of government in the Roman system. They could exercise their religious laws to a degree. What they could not do is enforce a capital punishment. They could not put anybody to death. That had to be done by the Roman courts. That's why they brought him to Pilate. They wanted him dead. And so they bring him to Pilate, and at first Pilate didn't want to hear anything about it. He didn't want to be bothered by these Jews. He says, why don't you guys go handle this little religious matter amongst yourselves? I don't have time for this. And then, here's the lie they made up about Jesus. They said, this guy Jesus is undermining the authority. He's causing problems in the Jewish community. Number 2, he's telling us not to pay taxes to Caesar. And number 3, he's calling himself a king. What they're trying to do to Pilate is make it look like Jesus was here trying to kind of form a resistance movement to try to undermine the authority of Caesar, something that Pilate obviously could not stand for. And so Pilate takes him in. After questioning him for a while, and after listening to his wife apparently had a dream about Jesus the night before in some form or fashion, and they found that this was a just man. They could find that he did nothing wrong. And he tried and pleaded with the Jews to say, look, but he's not worthy of death. And yet they kept pressing Pilate to say, crucify him, crucify him. They're rounding up the crowd. Pilate, once he found out that Jesus was from the area of Galilee, he was relieved. Because he knew that there was somebody in town who could hear this case in his place. And that was King Herod. He said, that's Herod's jurisdiction. I'm going to send Jesus to Herod. Let Herod handle this. I don't want this problem. He gets brought to Herod, and Herod had heard about Jesus. He was very interested in his miraculous abilities. He wanted him to put on a show of sorts, and Jesus wouldn't. He didn't say a word, and eventually he was mocked in Herod's court and sent back to Pilate. So he comes back to Pilate's court. This is all taking place in the same relative small period of time on this Saturday morning. And so now, Pilate, having no other options, at least in his mind, because of the persistence of the crowd, because he could find no guilt in him, he took a little basin of water and he washed his hands. You know, sometimes we kind of do this. I'm washing my hands of this matter. In other words, I don't find guilt in this man. I don't want to have anything to do with this, but I'll do as you say. But the guilt is on you guys, angry mob, and they gladly accepted that. They said, his blood be on our heads and our children. No problem for them. And so Pilate delivered him to be scourged and crucified. Now, I want to talk about 3 main points in this story. That's the story in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that I did not give that you're only going to get by reading those accounts. I encourage you to do so. But the first point I want to talk about is the fact that in Jesus we see the Creator being afflicted for the creation. Jesus, God in the flesh, Creator, being afflicted for the creation. Let's first look, if you're open to Matthew 26, pick up at verse 31. Imagine what this must have been like for Jesus. You know, a lot of times I think we like to think that we want to know the future. We want to know what's going to happen to us. We want the ability to see down the stream of time and see what's in our future. I don't think that we can bear that as human beings. I think only God can bear that, and that's why He's the only one that is eternal and isn't bound by time. Because if you knew the day you were going to die, if you knew some hard thing you were going to have to come up, imagine the grief and the anguish and the worry. We worry about things that are hypothetical in our lives. If we knew for sure something hard would happen, imagine the worry level. But Jesus knew exactly what would happen to him. He knew it from eternity. But in the first place, he was betrayed by his inner circle. He knew that his closest people were going to turn their backs on him. He had to bear that load. Notice here in verse 31, it says, "And Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter answered and said unto him, "Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble." Jesus said to him, "Assuredly, I say to you that this night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. Their words were bigger than their actions. as we know what would happen in just the coming hours. When he came to be captured, they're gone. Peter kind of lurched in the background. He went and followed Jesus. He wanted to see what happened to him. But even he, when asked, "Did you know Jesus? I've seen you with him. You have a Galilean accent. I know you're from Galilee." No, it's not me. You got the wrong guy. Denied him 3 times. And at that moment, he heard the rooster crow. And the Luke account tells us that Jesus looked at him eye to eye, right at that moment. And Peter breaks down and weeps. Jesus knew that moment was coming. He knew that all of his disciples would betray him. In that culture, your inner circle was like your family. And to be betrayed by them, in our culture, is a social offense, but back then even more. Complete desertion. He had to bear that load. He was afflicted with that knowledge in the back of his mind. He also had intense sorrow and grief on account of his anticipation. Notice the account in the garden. Do you see Jesus here? We're now to the Garden of Gethsemane. He knows these are the last few minutes, hours of time where he would not be bound, where he wouldn't be beaten, ridiculed, falsely accused. These were his last few moments, so to speak, of earthly freedom. What would have been going through his mind? Well, we know because of what he prayed for, but do you see him? Do you see his tired eyes? Do you feel the cool of the night? Do you feel the atmosphere? Do you feel his vibes? Do you see his sweating skin? Do you see the bloody sweat? Do you hear his prayers coming out to God, wailing in Aramaic? Imagine this scene. Notice in verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee and began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." He needed the companionship of his friends. He needed them at this moment. And we see the human side of Jesus here. He needed those who were closest with him for these last few moments to be with him while he was enduring this exceedingly sorrowful grief. This term, exceedingly sorrowful, has also been translated deeply grieved, overwhelmed with sorrow. One paraphrase says terrible distress and misery. Another says crushed with anguish. That captures the sense and the force of this verb in our English vernacular. That's what he was feeling. This thing was weighing him down. It was more than he could bear almost. And so he prays. Verse 39, he went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." What does that phrase, "let this cup pass from me," mean? We wonder about that. It probably has reference to the way the Old Testament phrased certain things. It refers to a cup of judgment. That's the image here. It probably refers to his suffering. That's what he's talking about. This cup of judgment, not for his own sins, but for the sins of the world. But it's talking about the judgment on sin. And so that's what he's talking about. Let this cup and this pain pass from me. And so he has this intense sorrow and grief on account of the anticipation of the cross. This is before people start beating him and falsely accusing him. This is just by himself, knowing what's about to happen. Grieved by that, the creator for the creation. As sort of a side note, there's some very interesting parallels between the Mount of Transfiguration and the Garden of Gethsemane. The Mount of Transfiguration, Matthew 17, Jesus brings who? Peter, James, and John. Garden, same thing. Brings them both. The inner circle's with him. In Gethsemane, and also in the Mount of Transfiguration, there's a weariness of the disciples. Also, the disciples could not enter into what Jesus does. They weren't able to bear with him and to pray with him. They fell asleep. And on the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus was transfigured and made in this brightness and this glory. The disciples weren't able to do that. And also, in both accounts, angels attend to Jesus. Angels attend to Jesus, messengers coming to comfort him. In that case, of course, Moses and Elijah on the account of the Mount of Transfiguration. On the Mount of Transfiguration, you see Jesus' divine side. You see him glorified, shining, and probably what his resurrection body would look like. And then here in the garden, you see more of the human side. So some very unique parallels here at the last moments of Jesus' life. And so he had that anguish, knowing what he would have to undergo, but also the restraint of power. The restraint of power. Drop down to verse 53. Drop down to verse 53. Now, this is after his disciples, Peter, cut Malchus' ear off. They're trying to physically defend him. And Jesus is telling him, look, if I wanted to physically defend myself, I could handle it. Okay? I have access to 12 legions of angels. I know we sing the song sometimes, he could have called 10,000 angels, and that's great. But this number, really, 12 legions, probably has more reference to something like maybe 72,000. Depending on that. One legion probably had about 6,000 soldiers, depending on your translation. But the point is, Jesus could have called at any moment, called this whole thing off. Just like in the temptation, he could have turned that stone into bread when he was so hungry. He had the power to do it. He had the power to stop all of this. But nonetheless, he couldn't. Imagine how much harder that made his anguish about what he had to go through, knowing at any moment he could pull the plug. Think about our lives. If we ever had that easy button, where we could have just called it off when things got rough. Would we press it? It'd be easy to. Jesus could have done that, but he did not, which shows us how intent he was on doing what he did for the remission of our sins. And so, obviously, the Creator was afflicted for the creation. We could talk about how he was spat upon, how he was ridiculed when he was in possession of the Jews. We can't even imagine that scene. How horrible that must have been, to be betrayed and just left by himself. But nonetheless, the Creator suffers for the creation. Now, secondly, the guiltless, Jesus, is judged guilty by the guilty. Jesus is judged guilty by the guilty. He's guiltless. But those who are truly guilty are judging him as such. Notice here in 26, in verse 6. Go back to the beginning of this chapter. I just want to point something out. Matthew chapter 26, I said verse 6. Let's look at 3 and 4. It talks about the fact that they plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. It's interesting that they knew from the outset that they would have to get Jesus by deceit. They knew it would have to be by some sort of a lie, because he was sinless, he was perfect. And so here what you have is these haters of Jesus using deceit, trying to convict somebody who had not an ounce of deceit in him. John 1:47. Here's an Israelite in which there is no guile, no deceit, same term. Play on words here. And so those who are guilty are trying to judge the guiltless one to try to make him look guilty. If you study the Jewish legal system, which I'm not going to get into very much, just a little bit. There's been whole books written on this topic about how illegal Jesus' trial was. How every step of the way they violated their own law after law after law. This case would have been thrown out in a millisecond in our justice system, if we're going by the rules. Everything was illegal about it. Some have said that there are 12 reasons why this trial was illegal. First of all, one reason is, we're not going to go look at all 12, but one reason is that he was arrested illegally. They weren't allowed to arrest somebody at night in this manner without a formal charge. Jesus had no formal charge. It hadn't happened. And even the charge that he did have was a lie. So it was illegal for them to arrest him in this manner, not having a formal charge against him. So right at the very beginning, illegal by their own law. Also, he was illegally subjected to a secret preliminary trial by night. The fact that he got brought in this way before an accusation against him even was taken was illegal. The indictment was illegal. It was an unprovable charge. They couldn't prove anything, and therefore they could not. That wasn't admissible in their courts. It happened before sunrise, and therefore he didn't have anyone who was able to testify on his behalf. In a normal trial, they wouldn't have been done in one night. It had to last beyond the day, especially for a capital trial. So the fact that it was so soon, it was so quickly transacted, was one reason it was illegal. But also, Jesus had no one to plead on his behalf. Under normal circumstances, he would have been able to have witnesses come in and so forth, but because they did it at night, that wasn't able to take place. And we could keep going on, but basically every step of the way, this was an illegal trial. So to call it a trial in any sense of the word justice really doesn't make a lot of sense. This is more like a carnival court. where they knew what they were going to do. They were going to justify it however they were going to justify it. They wanted him dead. And so everything was unjust about this trial. They were guilty, trying to judge the guiltless as guilty. Also, Pilate, he wasn't after justice. He knew that there was nothing wrong with Jesus. And in fact, the text tells us that he knew it was because of the Jews' jealousy that Jesus would be put to death. That was at least his perception. So he knew that Jesus did nothing wrong, and yet he still ends up delivering him. Why? Because he's more concerned about his political career, probably. He doesn't want to report getting back to Caesar that he's not able to keep these Jews under control. He has this mob howling out, and it wasn't justice he was after. It was after appeasing the crowd, probably looking out for his own career. And so if you look at 62 through 64, notice, and the high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under an oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven." Do you know what scripture Jesus is quoting here? Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. And that prophecy in Daniel is looking forward to the person, to the individual who would be the Messiah, who would be the heavenly ruler and judge, the embodiment of Israel's call, the one who would come in glory and reign forever as king. And so what Jesus is saying here, he's saying, yes, I'm the Son of God, I'm the Messiah, and in fact, I'm the judge of the whole universe. You're trying to judge me, I'm your judge. That's exactly what he was saying, and that's why the high priest reacted in such a way. Because it's the truth. Jesus was the Messiah. So, we have here in the second place the guiltless being judged guilty by the guilty. And we see the injustice of this whole thing. And then the last place, the just was given for the unjust. The just was given for the unjust freedom. Let's look here at chapter 27. This will be our last point, 15 through 26. Chapter 27, 15 through 26. It says, "Now at the feast the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished." It was a custom around the Passover that they would release one of the prisoners from the prison, that this would be done by Pilate as a custom every year. And so that's what's being referred to here in verse 15. 16 says, "And at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas." Barabbas means, literally, his name means son of a father. Son of a father. Jesus is the son of the Father. We see some parallelism here. We'll come back to that. "Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, 'Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?' For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy." Verse 19, "While he was sitting at the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, 'Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him.' But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." That's the last thing he expected to happen. Barabbas was kind of this rank criminal. Think of the most rank criminal that you can picture in your mind. That's Barabbas. He was an insurrectionist. The other texts tell us that he was guilty of many things. He was truly a criminal. They did not want this man on the loose. But they wanted Jesus dead so badly that they said, "Release Barabbas. You keep Jesus and crucify him." And so this surprised Pilate. The governor answered and said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" They said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water, washed his hands before the multitude, and said, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. So here you have Barabbas, who truly is an insurrectionist. And you have Jesus, who's innocent, who's being convicted for insurrection, insubordination to Caesar. There's a lot of parallels between these two. On the one hand, Barabbas is guilty. Jesus is innocent. The guilty is pardoned here. The guilty is pardoned. The guilty is set free. And the innocent has to pay the price of death, having committed no crimes himself. Now, why did God give us this information in the Bible? Why did He give so much information about Barabbas? Could be just to help paint the picture of what happened around the trial, but I think there's a deeper theological meaning than that. It seems like there's more here about Barabbas, because the fact is, this same story occurred 6 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago with the man standing before you. I was guilty, worthy of death, destruction. That's what I earned through my sin. But the guiltless one came in on my behalf. So I didn't have to pay the price. That I could walk away scot-free like Barabbas did from the pain of my sin, from the guilt of that sin. I'm Barabbas. And so are you. This is the story of Christ. This is the story of redemption. This is the gospel. The perfect Son of God, the Lamb of God, was given for the sins of the world, that the guiltless one would be punished for the sins of the world, so we could walk away scot-free. So we could walk away knowing that we're safe before God. That's what Jesus did for us on the cross. He hasn't done it yet in His trial, but that's what's happening with Barabbas. Now, I don't know if Barabbas stuck around to watch the crucifixion. That was the death that was supposed to be for him. I don't know if he stuck around. Probably not. If I were him, I would have got out of town, most likely. But we can't do that, can we? We can't look away at the cross. We can't hear the story of Jesus and learn what He suffered for us. This is all happening for our benefit. We can't hear that story and look away from the cross. We can't do that. We need to meditate upon it. We need to think about it. We need to realize what Christ did for us. And that's the gospel. We'll talk more about the crucifixion next week. We're going to extend the Lord's invitation at this point as our custom. The same Jesus we're reading about that suffered all that for you and me, He wants us all to be saved. He wants us to come to a knowledge of Him. He wants us to become Christians. He wants us in His church. He wants us to be forgiven, but we have to come to Him. We have to obey the gospel. 2 Thessalonians 1:7. Obeying the gospel means we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that we repent of our sins, that we confess sin before men, that we are baptized for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved." When we do that, we're added to the body of the redeemed, added to His church, given forgiveness, redemption, and Christ has purchased us from the slavery of sin, and now we're servants of His. That's the plan of salvation. That's what He wants all of us to do. If you become a Christian, and for some reason you forgot about this story of Jesus, and you've let your love for Him grow cold, let it be rekindled this morning. Remember Jesus who cried in the garden for you. Remember the one who endured the slaps and the punches and the ridicule, being spat upon, and the crucifixion for you. Remember that. Let that renew your faith. And if you need to do that in a public way this morning, if you need prayers at this congregation, we want to help you right now while we all stand and sing.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus.